Thank you, Michael. Before I introduce our next panelist, Jose Pertierra, who represents the government of Venezuela in its efforts to extradite Jose Posada Carriles, I wanted to just mention a couple of things about the terrorists, Jose Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch. They were both educated at the School of Americas. They were financed by the CIA. They are CIA operatives. They have been supported, protected, as I said, financed, encouraged, and given assignments directly by the United States. And this went on for decades. Two activities that Posada is directly involved in and has directly accepted responsibility for. It were the 1976 bombing of a civilian Cubana airliner that was returning from the Pan American Games. And who was on that plane? As I said, it was a civilian plane, and the entire Cuban junior fencing team was on that flight. And they were returning to Cuba with their medals that they had won at that athletic event. And that's who he killed. In 2000, the Ibero-American Summit was taking place in Panama, and heads of state from around the world were attending that. Just off the coast of Panama, a boat was intercepted with very powerful C3 explosives, enough to blow up the whole convention center, sort of like this, and everybody there would have been killed. All the presenters, heads of state, students, people like you and me. The reason that boat was intercepted with Posada on board was because of information that was furnished by Cuban intelligence agents. They were there to protect the lives of heads of state and ordinary people like us in this room. And these perpetrators are the people that the United States has protected. The FBI itself called Bosch the most dangerous terrorist in the world and suggested that he be deported. Rather than that, Bush Sr. pardoned him. He walked in the streets of Miami, where even a street was named after him, until the day he died, and proudly accepted responsibility for what he did. So with that long introduction, I'd like to introduce Jose Pertierra.
Thank you. I do, like Michael, like to stand up when I talk, because they taught me that in school. I don't know why, but I can't speak sitting down. I was born in Cuba. Came to the United States when I was like 10 years old, because we weren't fleeing communism. My mother was fleeing from her mother-in-law. She hated Armenia. Never could say it. Always said Armenia. And when we arrived in Miami, as most Cubans do, we went to the offices of the U.S. Refugee Service, and we met a nice American gentleman who worked with the Immigration Service, who explained to us about a program that existed back then in Miami that would fly a Cuban family one way anywhere in the United States as long as they promised not to live in Miami. Even then, back in the early 60s, the U.S. government was concerned about what would happen to Miami if all these right-wing Cubans were to establish residency there. So when my mother heard about that, my father was out looking for work, so I was with my mother and my sister. The man put out a big map of the United States on the table, and Miami was here where I'm standing. And she looked way to the other side, and she said, Jose Ignacio, what is the name of that town over there? I looked and I said, Los Angeles. And she said, dile al americano que vamos para allá. Tell me we're going back. So I grew up with Cesar Chavez and not with Mascanosa. And for that I'm glad. And now I live in a suitcase between Washington, Caracas, and La Habana. But I come here to talk about Posada and about the past. You know, the thing that strikes me about all this U.S.-Cuba conflict and the Miami-Cuban conflict with Cuba is the amount of hatred that is generated by Miami Cubans and by the right-wing people. You know, we don't hate these guys nearly as much as they hate us. I spent 4.5 months in El Paso recently when Luis Posada Carriles was being tried for immigration violations. I was in the same hotel as Posada and his cronies. Got my life threatened. I saw him every day. He didn't threaten my life, but his followers did. I went to the courthouse every day, and it was unbelievable the amount of hatred and venom directed against me by people that I should be hating for all that they've done. I remember one time I got on the elevator, and Posada was there, the lawyer for Posada was there, the lawyer's wife, who hates more than all of them put together, was there, and he looked at me with venom in their eyes. And I had to say, look, I'm not the terrorist. You know? But that is the reason why they have murdered, since the advent of the revolution, almost 2,500 Cuban citizens, and why they have maimed over 2,000 others, and why they blew up an airplane with ordinary citizens, with young kids who were members of the fencing team, with a little girl from Guyana who was only 9 years old, who people forget about, but she was 9 years old. Her name was Sabrina, and she was blown to smithereens in this plane. I've been representing the government of Venezuela to try to extradite him. But really, the most interesting thing is how this whole thing was concocted. It was a conspiracy by Luis Posada Carriles. By the way, his name is Luis. Luis Posada Carriles, Orlando Bosch, and 2 Venezuelan henchmen who confessed. You know, the 2 Venezuelans confessed to having been trained by the CIA, having been trained by the Venezuelan secret police as well in the use of explosives, and having worked for Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch. This last year marked the 35th anniversary of the downing of the plane. The plane was down in Barbados, off the coast of Barbados. I was there for the 35th anniversary. It's right off the coast. A bay called Deep Water Bay, because the water is so deep. When the plane went down, it's still buried underneath because it's so far down, even though it's right next to the beach. There were 73 people on board, 24 of them members of the Cuban fencing team. 58 of the 73 were Cubans, so Cuba put up most of the dead. There were Guyanese on board, there were Koreans on board. These guys were paid $25,000, these Venezuelans who put the bombs on the plane. $25,000 by their own admission. The way it happened was they went on board the plane in Trinidad, and they placed 2 bombs, one underneath a passenger seat where Freddy Lugo, one of the Venezuelans, was seated, and it was in a camera. The other in a tube of Colgate toothpaste in the rear bathroom of the plane. And it was C4 plastic explosives. You can't get that at the hardware store. It's usually an explosive that governments have, but hardware stores don't. The plane landed in Barbados, and these 2 gentlemen got off, leaving the bombs behind. The bombs were timed to go off. When these 2 Venezuelans confessed, they even drew a diagram of the detonator with different colors on it, showing how long the bombs had before they would explode. When the plane took off again in Barbados, the first bomb exploded underneath the seat that was then being occupied by little Sabrina. That bomb caused a great deal of smoke in the cabin. And we hear the cockpit recordings, and we hear the pilot and the co-pilot trying to stem the smoke so they could see and pilot the plane back to safety. They could still navigate the plane. They asked that the door be closed to the cabin to try to keep the smoke out. They asked for permission to return to the airport. It was granted to them, and the plane banked off in the direction of the airport. And right above a beach, ironically called Paradise, the second bomb in the rear bathroom of the plane exploded. And that rear part of those planes controlled the navigation of the plane. And that's when the plane went way up in the air and then back down again into the waters. Had it crashed on the beach, a lot of people would have been killed. It crashed right in front of the beach. A lot of people saw it crash. I talked to a witness, a man who had been water skiing nearby. And he, at that moment, was putting gas in his boat. When he saw the plane go down, he was the first on the scene. And he told me he saw 2 torsos without legs, and he saw several legs floating in the water. He helped gather the debris, not the body parts, but the debris. And an investigation ensued. The 2 guys who set the bombs got scared. They saw what had happened, and they fled Barbados. They got on a plane and went to Trinidad. One of them had used a false name to get on the plane. So authorities began tracking them, and they looked kind of suspicious even in Trinidad. So folks called the police. Before the police arrived, they contacted Caracas. They called Posada Carriles several times. Couldn't get through to him. Talked to his secretary, Celia Toledo, and told her that in code, the bus is down and the dogs are dead. The dogs being, of course, the passengers, the bus being the plane. They asked for help. They asked to be taken to the American embassy, and then they didn't go for some reason. But they asked the taxi cab driver to take them to the American embassy. Why? You can only guess. They were then arrested, and the best investigation in this whole case was carried out by a police official in Trinidad named Dennis Ramduar, who got the confessions from him. And these guys, they said exactly what had happened, why it happened, where the conspiracy took place. And Venezuela immediately arrested Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch, who were at the time in Caracas. There began a long trial for these guys. First, they were tried in a military tribunal, and that was not an appropriate forum because this wasn't a military crime. These guys were not military, and then the case was shifted to civilian courts. The 2 Venezuelans were given 20 years or convicted. Freddy Lugo, one of the Venezuelans, is now driving a taxi in Caracas. And then Ricardo was released and has disappeared from sight. The last trace we have of him is a Miami Herald story about 5 years ago that said he'd been working undercover for the Drug Enforcement Administration in southern Florida. And their confessions are really interesting because they not only draw a diagram of the detonator, they draw a diagram of the terrorist organization that they were working for, called Cuba. And at the diagram, it's very interesting because they have executive committee or executive commission of Cuba, and then arrows as to who they answer to. And the arrows point to CIA, FBI. This is not drawn by Venezuelan, Cuban intelligence officials. This is drawn by the people who placed the bombs on the plane. There were declarations against interest, we call them in the law. Orlando Bosch, after serving many years in jail, was released on a technicality and came to Miami. Posada Carriles escaped. He escaped. He tried to escape 3 times. The 3rd time he was successful. He, after working for the death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador and trying to blow up an auditorium full of students in Panama in 2000 with over 100 kilos of C4, he eventually made it to the United States in the year 2005. in the spring on a boat called the Santrina. That's when Venezuela asked for his extradition. He asked for his extradition based on the extradition treaty between Venezuela and the United States that dates all the way back to 1922, where the number one extraditable offense is murder, and he was wanted in Venezuela still for murder. He had a pending trial before his escape. We asked for his extradition also based on two international conventions dealing with the protection of civilians from acts of terrorism. One dealing with civil aviation, called the Montreal Convention, and the other one dealing with the protection of civilians against terrorists who use explosives. The international conventions say very clearly that if the country that has the fugitive is not willing to extradite him, it shall, I mean, if anybody knows anything about the law, when you hear shall, it means there's no discretion. It shall prosecute the crime as if the crime had occurred in the territory where the individual was found. So the United States should either extradite him or try him. And it has done neither. What it tried him for was for lying. Lying to the Immigration Service on immigration forms. That was the 4.5-month trial in El Paso, Texas, that I attended. During that trial, a lot of things came out, and one of the most interesting things that came out was the lawyer, the prosecutor for the Department of Homeland Security, who had prosecuted the case originally against him on immigration charges, testified in this case. And on direct examination from the Department of Justice lawyers, she said that when she got Posada Carriles' files, she saw that he was more than an immigration violator, that he was wanted for terrorism and murder. So she went to the assistant U.S. attorney in Miami, because this case was being done out of Miami. She went to this woman and she said, why are we doing a deportation case against this guy in El Paso, Texas? Why aren't we prosecuting him for murder? And the woman refused to do it. The woman prosecutor, the assistant U.S. attorney, is a woman by the name of Carolyn Peck Miller. Carolyn Peck Miller is the lead prosecutor in the case of the Cuban Five. The woman who prosecuted and still prosecuting zealously the case of the Cuban Five, who refused to prosecute the case of Posada Carriles. That's not something Cuba has said, that's not something Venezuela has said, that's something the Department of Homeland Security has said in open court under oath. It's very interesting. Anyway, Posada Carriles is the emblematic terrorist, but not the only one, who has been engaged in acts of terrorism against Cuba since the advent of the revolution. To combat that terrorism, that hatred, the indiscriminate murder of innocent civilians, of children, Cuba asked repeatedly the FBI to arrest the terrorists. And repeatedly the United States refused. Cuba, maybe innocently, say some people, maybe not, decided that they would send agents of Cuban intelligence to the United States, not to penetrate and gather intelligence from the U.S. government, not to obtain classified information, but to penetrate the Cuban American right-wing terrorist groups in Miami that were carrying out this violence in violation of U.S. and international law, but also U.S. law, with the hope that the United States, with the evidence in hand, would arrest these folks. Fidel Castro, the very famous anecdote that he told about in a speech he gave a few years ago, Fidel Castro tells how he approached Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a Nobel Prize-winning author from Colombia, and gave him a handwritten letter to hand President Clinton, telling Clinton that Cuba wanted cooperation in this fight against terrorism and about the evidence that Cuba had gathered on these individuals. And Garcia Marquez tells how he couldn't talk to Clinton, but he got to see Mac McLarty, the chief of staff for Clinton, who told him, we have an enemy in common, namely terrorism. We can work together. And in an unprecedented meeting between FBI agents and Cuban intelligence officers then occurred in Cuba. And Cuba gave the FBI a lot of information, a lot of evidence. They also gave the New York Times a lot of evidence. The New York Times didn't publish the story, and the FBI didn't arrest the terrorists. What they did was they arrested the Cuban intelligence agents who had come to the United States to penetrate these terrorist groups. And in a trial that was celebrated in Miami, the city filled with hatred against Cuba, a city where nobody who has any relation to Cuba can ever get a fair trial. These 5 men were convicted and sentenced to very long prison sentences. One of them, Gerardo Hernandez, was given 2 life sentences. All of them but one are still in jail, and they're going to be in jail a while. They've been in jail now 13 years. The one who was released, Rene Gonzalez, is free, but under supervised liberty, supervised probation, which means he can't go back to Cuba. He can't go back and be with his family. He can't go back to be with his sick brother who's very, very sick with cancer. He can't go back to be with his wife, his daughters. He is obligated to remain in the United States and in southern Florida specifically, which is incredible because, you know, they have it out for this man. This man penetrated their organizations. He's a dangerous terrorist. And the United States is forcing this man to remain among these terrorists irresponsibly, I think, because should anything happen to him, it is the responsibility of the United States government, not simply the terrorists who would do a terrible act against them. I read the decision of the court, which I think will be reconsidered eventually, but the decision of the court not giving him permission to return to Cuba said that it's necessary that Rene first establish that he has reincorporated himself into U.S. society and is taking vocational training classes and so forth. Well, this man in his motion said he doesn't want to live in the United States. He wants to return to Cuba to live. He doesn't care if he ever comes back to the United States. So it's a decision based on a number of flawed major premises. The latest thing is he asked for permission to go back to see his brother, who's, as I said, he's got cancer in a very bad way, maybe dying, and the government recently opposed that motion. They left a window open, saying, "Well, if they granted, these are the conditions, but we oppose it." I'm going to close not with my words, but with their words. When they were sentenced, these men stood up and for the first time really spoke to the court and to the American people. And I'm going to read you excerpts, brief excerpts of what each of them had to say. Gerardo. I want the gentlemen of the prosecution to know that the only blood there may be on these hands is the blood of my brothers and sisters who have fallen or been cowardly murdered in the countless acts of aggression and terrorism perpetrated against my country by individuals who freely walk the streets of this city today. And it is for this blood that I made the pledge to sacrifice even my own life if doing so could protect my people from such crimes. Ramon Lavanino says, gentlemen of the prosecution, and it's good to remind Americans of this, excuse me if you're American, but it's good to remind you of this. Whether you like it or not, Cuba is an independent and sovereign country. That means it doesn't belong to the United States. You hear the language that Americans, even good-hearted American people, tell you when they refer to Cuba and other countries in the world. It's almost the same kind of vocabulary parents use with their children. You know, well, they're not behaving. Cuba is an independent country, and it does not belong to the United States. Ramon says it has its own legitimate government, its own president, its own martyrs and heroes, and its own convictions. Cuba is not different from the United States, and gentlemen, Cuba must be respected. This has been a political trial, he said, therefore we are political prisoners. Tony Guerrero, Miami is an impossible place for justice. This has been, above all else, a political trial. Fernando Gonzalez. I sincerely trust that one day Cuba will have no need for people like me to come to this country voluntarily and out of love for their country and their people to fight against terrorism. Rene Gonzalez. I love this one. He says, go back to Mark Twain and forget about Rambo if you really want to leave your children a better country. They've been convicted. The Supreme Court denied cert. There's petitions pending. I don't think legally they're going to win, but politically they will. Politically they will win the same way that the Puerto Ricans who were in jail in the United States for so many years, Lolita Lebrón, Rafael Cancel Miranda, and others, the same reason why the United States decided to swap them in 1979 for people who were in jail in Cuba, American intelligence agents in Cuba. Those are the same reasons that will affect the trade today. The same reasons why back in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson exercised executive clemency on hundreds of socialists and peaceniks and religious leaders who had been imprisoned and sentenced to long prison sentences. And after the war, President Wilson, not pardoned them, gave them executive clemency and let them go home. There's a marvelous New York Times article from 1919 where they cite the spokesman for the Department of Justice saying, back when those sentences were handed out, there was a war going on, and passions were heightened. The war is over, and it's now time to move on. And I hope that's what will affect the leadership of the Cuban. Thank you.